So it's always difficult to be the last panel after a 2-day conference. But if there's anything that we can gather inspiration from here, we have a fantastic all-star panel here, representatives from the Five Eyes, from the 5 countries listed here, that have graciously agreed to do a public panel amidst their official business, which will be coming in the coming days. So we're very grateful to have you. And if there is any inconvenient questions or any challenges, maybe one of the panel will be able to create one of those emergency alerts like we heard at lunch, and we can all duck out of the conference. So before I get into a little bit of setting the scene and turning it over to the panel, there are very few rules. We've talked a lot about rules during this conference and the rules-based order. I know for this panel alone, there will be a certain set of rules, but they're very simple. First of all, we're going to have our comments very short, ideally. So please keep your comments limited to about 5 minutes. If you go 3 minutes, that'll even be better. The second rule is that I know, because we're at the end of the day, everyone is thirsting for that coffee. So we will have to break at the end of the first round of instigating comments from all of our 5 panelists for a coffee. And the last 2 rules, one of the rules is here for the panel, and the second rule here is for the audience, is that you have to be open and frank. This is going to be an open and frank discussion. And for the audience, please give nice and hard questions. So we hope that after your coffee break, that you've stimulated yourself enough to give this all-star panel a range of very difficult questions. So with that being said, we've talked a lot throughout this conference about some of the challenges. I think as Brett mentioned, as we closed our lunch, there's been a heavy dose of realism. I wouldn't say pessimism. We're facing a range of different challenges. We've talked about some of the different alignments and arrangements that are in place to help mitigate some of those challenges. We've talked, for example, about AUKUS a little bit. We've talked about the Quad. But one that we haven't spent as much time talking about so far is the Five Eyes. And I think we're really privileged to have the 5 individuals on this panel to give their perspectives about how each of them view the challenges in the Indo-Pacific, and then ideally where they see themselves working together. So my last caveat on this is, traditionally when we think about the Five Eye, we think about signals intelligence, we think about the alignment, the intelligence sharing alignment that's existed since the end of World War II. But I would urge the panel and the audience in their questions to think a bit bigger, to think a bit beyond the horizon, and think of the strategic foreign policy dimensions to where the 5 partners could work, should work, and potentially are already working in this part of the world. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it straight over to the panel for the ones who actually have to give us all this great advice and be beacons of knowledge on where we should be going. And I'll start first with my Australian colleague, Rear-Admiral Christopher Smith, Deputy Commander of the Royal Australian Navy. Rear-Admiral, the floor is yours for about 5 minutes, or maybe 3.
Thank you. Pete, thanks for asking that dumb question, because I had the same question about the freezer. It didn't make it. It must have been an Australian thing. Five Eyes started as an information sharing in a period that we know was under considerable pressure from countries with heritage. But it's not just about information, and I want to share a really quick quote from our Deputy Prime Minister. Less a piece of paper than it's a network of people, politicians, policy officers, intelligence officials and soldiers. He skipped the sailors piece, but we'll work that in. Professionals who grow up working together, serving in each other's institutions, deploy to combat zones and come to each other's aids. Professionals who commit to each other depend less on a treaty's text than on a set of shared convictions. So that's where I'm going to start with where Five Eyes is in the piece. It is a deeply ingrained piece of every person I know operating in the Royal Australian Navy and my counterparts and friends that I operate in Five Eyes space. It is much more than information sharing. And we know that information sharing in itself can be dangerous, and we've seen that before. The political aspects of what the Australian government used to justify the Iraq War back in the day was based on information which was taken for granted, rolled out into the public, and was seen later to be a little bit flawed. So looking at that process again, and going back to that quote from the Deputy Prime Minister, Five Eyes is about this relationship of trust and understanding. And what that develops for us is the ability for us as a group of nations not only to share information, but to question, add value, add context, and really analyse it. And once you're in a room with a bunch of Five Eyes operators, there is no airs and graces. There is a bunch of views and ideas that are very different. And I deliberately put this chart up, and Chris, I had this idea before you said it yesterday, and it makes me feel like I've got a similar mind to Xi Jinping, which worries me. We all have our own perspective of the world, and we are from very different parts of the world. And I've just listened to a fantastic conversation around the Arctic, which I have zero information around, and yet I have expertise and experience in those other areas. So Five Eyes is not groupthink. Five Eyes is the contribution of us coming together to get better ideas and working forward. It's a community of shared worldview and common objectives going forward in the space. And it goes right down to the tactical level. And a really quick example I'll give, and I'll make it quick, is work health and safety legislation across the 5 countries is fundamentally different. So the safety group within Five Eyes is looking at the moment at a 1-page brief to provide commanding officers of task groups where we operate together to explain what the different legislation around work health and safety is, because it will result in individuals, commanding officers, acting in different ways depending on that. In Australia, you're personally liable, and the Royal Australian Navy and the ADF has a criminal record based on work health and safety convictions. That's not necessarily the case in other countries. So that is the level of discussion, understanding and context that we go to make sure that when we work together and fight together, we understand each other at a really deep level, all the way through to the very strategic level. The benefits of the Five Eyes is obviously that broader view and idea, that peer review and opportunity there. It's our broader experience, and where I see the opportunity going forward is in the different areas of operation that we're in, is continuing to leverage off each other's expertise and understanding of culture and region and activities, providing that peer review and context going forward, and that is where the real strength is. Do I necessarily see other groups coming into Six Eyes, Seven Eyes and all the rest of it? I think that would be difficult in the construct we have because of the historical side of the house, but I think Five Eyes sets a framework for us to expand that kind of sharing going forward, and it's all about human relationships. If you are not deeply invested in the way people think, what they're doing and what they are trying to achieve, then information sharing just becomes exactly that, information sharing. So the opportunity going forward is about understanding the framework we have in Five Eyes is a framework that deals in deep human relationships, and that is where we get our joy.
Thank you very much, Rear-Admiral, and very concise on timing. You know, I ask you for 5 minutes, you give me 4:59. If I was asking a diplomat for 5 minutes, I would get 50. So very much appreciate you being concise in the time, and a lot of really interesting insights. Especially, you know, want to pick back up after our discussion on this idea of Five Eyes Plus as well. And I think you addressed very rightly some of the challenges, but I do think there are some opportunities as well. So that maybe is something that we can dive into later on. I did want to move along, though, and next we have our Canadian colleague, Rear-Admiral Stephen Waddell, a Deputy Commander of the Royal Canadian Navy. And Admiral, you know, now is a very important time, obviously, in Canada. We've been waiting for this Indo-Pacific strategy for some time from the whole of government approach to the region, but it seems like a very, very critical time for Canada and its thought process in this part of the world. And we welcome your insights on the Five Eyes and how Canada could fit into this in the Indo-Pacific. Admiral, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jonathan. And we wait with anticipation our government's announcement on the Indo-Pacific strategy, and we, of course, will welcome that when it does arrive. So just a couple of points I would like to make. First of all, I acknowledge that we are on the Algonquin-speaking peoples, the Coastal Salish folks, local Songhees and Esquimalt nations, upon which land we work and play. And I'd also like to thank all of the MSC organizers and Jonathan for helping us through this this next panel, and of course for your upcoming assistance in our Five Eyes staff talks, which will be occurring over the next day and a half or so. I'd like to mention 3 points, and I know that you'll hear the Five Eyes theme throughout much of the panel. And of course, the reason why we're gathered here is to come together as a Five Eyes community, which we do on an annual basis to talk amongst our navies. But I want to focus on 3 points just to stimulate some of the conversation. The first is Canada is a growing nation in terms of population. Not long ago, we hit 38 million people, still growing, significant immigration targets to grow that population. But most of our population lives along that southern border with the United States. And so our cultural and historical sort of lens looks to the significant powerhouse that is the United States to the south of us, and that colors a lot of our societal thinking. That population, that demographic, a lot of it is in Quebec and Ontario, so a large portion to the east. And so it's one challenge to convince that population that Canada is a maritime nation. It's a completely additional challenge to convince that population that we are actually a Pacific nation. And so with our historical and cultural linkages to Europe, you can imagine as you're trying to message that as a Navy, as a maritime community, to that population that indeed we are a Pacific nation. Now, you don't need to explain that to people that live here in British Columbia. They know that, and the bulk of our economic trade by the sea is across the Pacific. But it remains a challenge for us as we develop policy, as we work with government and other partners to develop that policy and work on the right investments to make sure that we are consistently operating in the Pacific. And because of that lifeline in the Pacific, that is, of course, one of the main reasons why this base that we have on the West Coast, Esquimalt, is here. A long history from a Royal Navy investment back in the 1800s, fledgling Navy of the Canadian Navy in 1910, which, of course, grew from that and then took over stewardship of those facilities. But knowing, of course, that Canada, as I've said, is a Pacific nation, and the Canadian Armed Forces, a significant player in that, principally the Navy, given that we are given that the Pacific is a maritime theater. And as I've mentioned, that the dockyard fundamental in making sure that we can contribute that power into the Pacific theater. But we're routinely operating in the Pacific, and of course the Indian Ocean. You know, we've been a RIMPAC participant since every iteration since its inception in 1971. We've had a near persistent forward presence in the Pacific over the last 5 years, specifically supporting what we call Operation Neon, and that's the United Nations sanctions enforcement against North Korea. And of course, a number of freedom of navigation operations, as many as you know them to be. To us, that's just simple maritime law and operating at sea in an international environment, but transits through the Taiwan Strait and throughout the South China Sea to reinforce that freedom of navigation piece. And we've done that routinely, as I said, over the last 5 years. And then finally, the last point I would make, as a founding member of NATO and as a significant Arctic player, given the vast geography that you've just heard about with Ryan's presentation earlier, and coupled that with something that we will be talking as a Five Eyes community is our personnel challenges and shortages, notwithstanding the significant draw based on the Russian aggression against Ukraine, which of course has brought NATO together in the way that we have, and of course our commitments to that draw north into the Arctic, which of course is pulling us in that direction. Notwithstanding all of that, we've still been able to sustain 5 years of persistent forward operations in the Pacific. So I think that shows where our prioritization is as we balance all of those needs moving forward. And I think that as we look at and unpack this in the panel in the next little bit, we can talk about how we're achieving that prioritization effort moving forward. But fundamental in all of that is that shared awareness that the Five Eyes community brings together. And of course, I look forward to working with my colleagues over the next day and a half to unpack some of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Admiral. And I think after hearing your remarks, I'm looking even more forward to this Indo-Pacific strategy coming out. Your point, and I think it seems like a basic point, but I think it's one that needs to be, as you said, hammered in time and time again, is that we are a Pacific nation. And it leads me to think of an anecdote. I was in the Netherlands earlier this year in February, and the Netherlands have had an Indo-Pacific strategy out since November of 2020. And when I was meeting with our Dutch colleagues, our friends there in the Netherlands, they said, you know, we're happy, of course, to have our Indo-Pacific strategy out, but Canada, you're a G7 country. Look at your coastline. You have a massive Pacific coastline. The Netherlands, yes, they had the Dutch East Indies back in the day, but I mean, they're not a Pacific nation like we are. But yet we failed to have that strategy out yet. So I think we're all eagerly anticipating that and reminding everyone that we do have immense equities and stakes in this part of the world. The second thing that I thought was interesting that you mentioned, and I hope we get back to, is Operation Neon, because a lot of the discussions we've had already the past 2 days, of course, focus on the challenges that the PRC poses to this region. But when we think about Indo-Pacific security, we can't forget the challenge that DPRK is also posing, especially to two of our most important partners, Japan and South Korea in this region. And I think this is also one of the most tangible, concrete examples of where the Five Eyes and Five Eyes Plus is working with partners to ensure that North Korea isn't able to, or at least mitigating their ability to circumvent United Nations sanctions. So thank you, Admiral, for those remarks. With that being said, I'm going to pass it along to our New Zealand colleague, Commodore Melissa Ross, Deputy Commander of the Royal New Zealand Navy. Please, the floor is yours.
Kia ora koutou. Again, thank you everyone for the organisation of the conference today. It's been really good. It's a long way for us to come, but we've really enjoyed our time here. In terms of the Five Eyes, we have a really shared history amongst us and the common values which binds us together. And as well as the intelligence sharing that's been discussed, we operate together both within but also outside of the Pacific, and we have done so for many, many years. The Pacific, and from New Zealand's view, our climate change and strategic competition are our principal security challenges from a country who is wholly in the Pacific, and our people are from and of the Pacific. And you know, my own family tree goes all the way back to the first person exploring and discovering New Zealand. And it's interesting, over a lunch that we talked about fisheries, because the reason New Zealand was discovered was because Kupe, who discovered New Zealand, he was in an area where they were starting to run out of fish. And so he went looking elsewhere for the fish. And the reason he ran out of the fish, as the story goes, is because another person had come into the area and had used an octopus to fish that area out. And so he had to move away from the island that he was in at the time and looked for another place to live. So the lunchtime presentation was going back to my past. Within the Southwest Pacific, then, we have very close links to a number of the islands in the area, but we don't have all the answers in that area. Of course, we, though, leverage off our history with some of those other nations, even smaller than us, and that informs our current approach, because we have very close ties in terms of cultural ties. We do operate in the Southwest Pacific in terms of our approach with a respect for the Pacific leaders there. We seek solutions that they lead on, and that means we look to our partners to determine what we can do together there. We often find ways to achieve both our objectives and theirs, and then we'll work together on those. And because we train some of those smaller Pacific nations as well, we also are not afraid to then ask for their help when we do go to the Pacific, and we ask them if they can provide some people to fill in some of the gaps on our ships. That benefits us, and it also benefits them. And we know the standard of training that they have received. Maybe one other short story is maybe more soft power. We had a rugby team that went to the UK for a game. We play against the Royal Australian Navy and the Royal Navy. Because of some of our shortages in people, we didn't have enough people to field a rugby team. Might be a bit odd for New Zealand, but we had also ships in the Pacific. So we sought from the small Pacific nations some players, and the Fijians and the Tongans fronted up for us with 6 players. They were very big and tall, and we were very glad that they could join our team, and they were all wingers. But what that did was to bring us together, and then to take that team across. Now, we didn't win any games. However, that wasn't the reason we were going. We wanted to join the tournament. It's not a tournament with only 2 teams. It was much better with 3. But we were able to move our Pacific neighbours into an area and with our Five Eyes, or our 5 nations, or at least 2 of them, on the rugby field. We do listen as well. You know, we have an Indigenous population of our own, and we do try to take some of the lessons we learn in interacting with our own Indigenous population, and we take those into the Pacific. So we have learned to listen more than we talk, and therefore not dictating to them our solutions or our views and methods. Though that doesn't mean we don't speak openly, and we do that as well with our internal Indigenous people. We speak openly, and that's a really trusted relationship as well. We do lead with our Pacific partners and seek opportunities to share, and I mean, the strength that we have here up on the stage here is that we do that amongst ourselves, and then we can also take that into the Southwest Pacific as well. In terms of climate change, New Zealand is also impacted by climate change. We have sea level rising on our doorstep, in fact, at our naval base, and we therefore share what we know into the Pacific, and we gather also from those of us up here those lessons that we have all brought together. But in terms of other than the intelligence sharing, I have worked with all of the nations up here, and so have many of us, and so that cultural link that we have, those shared history and those values that we have is still very strong, and we look forward to it continuing and assisting each other as we go through some of these more challenging personnel times. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commodore Ross. And your anecdote about rugby diplomacy, I think, as a Canadian, makes me think about our sort of hockey diplomacy. And we have our American colleague here at the end. The United States, we have quite an interesting go-between when it comes to hockey games, and our leaders tend to swap cases of beer depending on who wins and who loses, and also many of our Nordic friends who I think are in the room as well. We have that similar sort of culture. But I appreciate a lot of your insights, especially New Zealand's role in the Pacific. I think is really, the South Pacific is really essential, and I think you highlighting that is very important. And also the issue of climate change. I think especially many of our partners in the South Pacific, this is the short, medium, and long-term challenge that they're facing. And the climate security cooperation, a lot of the work that you're doing already, I think is essential. So that's really happy that you spent the time to bring that point up. So if I can transition now to our colleague from the UK, Rear-Admiral Anthony Rimington, Assistant Chief of the Naval Staff of the Royal Navy. The floor is yours, sir.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. If I might just start by saying that there used to be some cachet attached to being a naval aviator, but I think when I grow up, I want to be an ice navigator now. I think my job, having thanked Admiral Topshee and the organisers for the opportunity to join the panel, is to try and bring a bit of perspective from a very obviously non-Pacific nation into what the Five Eyes Partnership means in the Pacific region. And I should caveat by saying I'm in week 3 of the job, so unsurprisingly, I've got some notes that are to help me plot my way through the topic. I think our perspective starts with the end of the Cold War. The nations of the world have welcomed increasing amounts of globalization. We talked about it yesterday, and the freer movement of people, goods, and information. It's had prosperity benefits for us all, and that drives a lot of the UK approach. The sea is absolutely central in that. 90% of the world's goods move by sea. I think we know that as an audience. Global merchant shipping tonnage has nearly trebled in the last 30 years. And almost half of the UK's food and natural gas, another commodity put into the spotlight by the Ukraine conflict, arrives by sea in the UK. 97% of communications are transmitted by undersea cables, as we talked about yesterday, and these are now as critical to nations as power plants or hospitals. 3 billion of the world's population rely on seafood as their primary source of protein, and we talked about that at lunchtime. And through climate change, we're expecting more of the world's oceans to become more accessible for more of the year. And having the world's oceans open and free, I think, is important to us all. Looking at the audience here, we don't need convincing of that, but often our governments do. Disruption to the global trade caused by the Suez Canal shutting last year brought home to the world in 6 days what navies have been trying to say for decades, that the sea is essential to economic prosperity. And even closer to home for us in the UK in September, the damage to both Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines under the ocean in Europe, thought to be safe below the surface of the Baltic Sea on the seabed, but seriously damaged and seemingly by intentional means. But why does the Indo-Pacific matter to the UK and the UK to the Indo-Pacific? Put simply, you've only got to look at the map that we saw earlier on. The Pacific is a maritime theatre that exemplifies the tyranny of distance. The only effective way to move large cargoes, information, and energy is by sea. And with the increased globalization of the last couple of decades, the geo-economic changes that have led many nations in a tilt away from the Euro-Atlantic and towards the Indo-Pacific, and that's where long-term prosperity from a UK view lies. And so the UK is looking for new alliances, partnerships, friendships, and renewing old ones. In 2020, the Royal Navy forward deployed 2 patrol vessels to the Indo-Pacific. They're not massive in size, they're not bristling with weaponry, but they punch above their weight when it comes to impact, influence, and the ability to conduct joint training, exercises, maritime patrols. And through their presence and engagement, we're working with more friends, more partners, and more allies in more areas than we have done in some time. In fact, in decades in some cases. We're able to meaningfully revive relationships that we had not serviced effectively for too long. And we're able to do it as a partner and a friend, but most importantly, as an equal with the nations operating there. We don't seek to dictate or impose our view on those we interact with, but rather to listen to them, the cultural connection that we were just hearing about. Hear their concerns and use their knowledge as the experts in their waters in what is their part of the world. And the cables and pipelines that carry our data and energy don't stop at the 12-mile limit. And so having good relationships all over the world matters. Now, the Chinese would say that building alliances and partnerships, the concept of coupling, is what weaker nations do, while strong nations decouple, form bilateral relationships, and inevitably those benefit the stronger partner. The UK view is unsurprisingly different. Alliances are a source of strength. They're not without fault, and they can be slow and ponderous to move and gain consensus, but they do allow us to bring together the best of all that we can be as a group. And as militaries and as navies, as well as nations, we're good at forming alliances and partnerships. And this matters because grey zone activity continues unabated, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. The threats of transnational crime, maritime and multinational terrorism, or economic exploitation have not receded. In fact, they're as stark as ever. And whilst we must continue to respond to the events in Eastern Europe. We cannot afford to be distracted by them. The ambitions and actions of the Chinese state, from island building in the South China Sea that we heard about at lunchtime yesterday, insidious debt diplomacy through the string of pearls in the Indian Ocean, the smuggling of resources through the waters around North Korea against UN sanctions, and employing the ghost fleets of trawlers, ravishing the seas of protein that island nations depend upon for their very livelihood, are a direct affront to the rules-based international order under which relative peace and stability has been maintained for decades. And it has a very real effect, I would argue. In the South Pacific Islands, concerns may be less about great power conflict and more about the immediate and destructive threats of transnational crime, illegal mass fishing, and climate change. Our ability to show partnership and leadership in these areas matters. So in conclusion, we are, all of us, interested and invested in maintaining a peace and security dynamic that's to the benefit of all. And so as we find ourselves facing real challenges to the way of life that we want to live, and a realization that the maritime environment is being brought to the fore, how we approach this as a maritime community, both nationally and internationally, will be essential to ensuring continued security, peace, and prosperity at sea. And from a UK perspective, whatever happens in tomorrow's autumn Treasury statement in the House of Commons, the Royal Navy is being invested in by the UK government, and our tonnage will grow. We're creating a fleet capable of greater global presence, investing in international alliances and friendships, and ensuring that our warfighting capability is as good as it can be, all as part of a deterrent posture alongside our like-minded friends and allies. And so through the Five Eyes, through NATO, through AUKUS, through FPDA and other relationships, we will continue to deepen our engagement across all aspects of the maritime sector in order to ensure that the global commons of the sea are kept free and fair for the benefit of all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Admiral Remington. Some great insights there, and thank you for highlighting some of the recent developments from the UK and this part of the world. I liked your last point on complementarity, because it's not the idea that one organization will replace the other, but the idea that the Five Eye, alongside AUKUS, alongside other arrangements, will be the way going forward. It's not either or, it's sort of all of the above. And also some of the key areas where the UK is excelling in this part of the world. Japan, one example, the defense relationship with Japan, I think, has been quite a model in recent months, and some of the developments in that relationship, in addition to dusting off the five-power defense arrangement in the region as well. So I think the UK is taking some significant steps. And the last point, your importance on the sea lines of communication, I think is essential. I mean, Greg's very sobering presentation on the South China Sea, I think it should be a reminder for a lot of us that some of our Northeast Asian allies, Japan and South Korea in particular, rely 80 to 90% for their energy from the Gulf. This is especially acute for Japan after Fukushima. They used to have 30% of their energy indigenously through nuclear power, and that effectively has been reduced. So if we think what's happening right now in Europe in energy security terms is an issue, just wait until we have these sea lines of communications potentially challenged in the South China Sea or elsewhere. And we have two of our most important allies in the region that are cut off potentially from energy. So I appreciated your remarks there, Admiral. So if I can turn it last but certainly not least to Rear-Admiral Tom Moninger, Director Plans, Policy and Integration at the United States Navy. Tom, please.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I appreciate the opportunity to sit up here with this distinguished panel. And sir, thanks for the opportunity to speak here. I guess going last, you've stolen all of my remarks. And so, Jonathan, I'll try to make that, I'll yield some time back to you. On the sports front, the only thing I can offer is no rugby analogies, but we love it when we get your Australian rules or rugby players place kicking for us on our football teams. So they kick it much better than we do. So we often speak, and then I'm a new guy at the job too, so I'm going to read my notes if that's all right, Tony. I'll leverage your example. We often speak of Five Eyes with the perspective of sharing intelligence, and we kind of talked about that already. However, if we look deeper, Five Eyes is a case study in two factors that drive cooperation. We've said it, you've heard it already, trust and sharing. I did, as new to this, I wanted to look up, where the abbreviation came from, the Five Eyes. I figured out that it's an outgrowth of the Atlantic Charter in 1941, the UK and the US looking at a common enemy, and then broadened to include all the members on the stage here. And then, I see it, and it's listed. That's listed on this. Well, it says here. It says Five Eyes, spelled EYES, and that now explains to me why it's FVEY. But where it came from was just all the countries. The labels of the documents that were shared in World War II listed all five of the countries: Australia, Canada, New Zealand, UK, US. Eyes only was the classification, and so that got abbreviated to Five Eyes. And so that's my history lesson for you, or just to myself to look it up. And that's probably, I could probably stop there, Jonathan. No. So, okay. So first, on the factor of trust, Five Eyes demonstrates a rare level of consistent and unquestionable trust. From a naval perspective, we collect and analyze intelligence at sea and ashore and place trust in our allies to apply that needed discretion that protects our decision-making advantage. Second is the factor of sharing. Five Eyes can't exist without the ability to share. The ability grows as we remove barriers to information sharing, barriers created by policy, technology, and processes. And the U.S. is probably the biggest offender in that, and we are committed to reducing those barriers not only in the Five Eyes relationship, but with all our allies and partners as the strength of our relationship allows. So, but by sharing information, specifically intelligence information, we create a synergy across the Five Eyes alliance, and that effect amplifies, the efforts of our nation and our ability to project naval power. In the Indo-Pacific, the information sharing amongst the Five Eyes helps build connections, and within the region and then beyond. And it drives global prosperity, and that's something that we've another theme here. Both objectives that flow from the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, which was released at the beginning of this year. With trust and sharing information, we build connections along the path to greater naval cooperation and interoperability of our forces. So given the Indo-Pacific's vast maritime spaces, we see the importance that navies play in driving regional prosperity. Stability promotes prosperity, and it's essential to preserving a free and open global maritime commons. So I'd like to close just by quoting our Chief of Naval Operations in his navigation plan to our Navy released this year. He talks about, after World War II, America and its allies ushered in an era of great power, peace, and shared prosperity around the globe, establishing an international rules-based order. We've talked a lot about that. This progress and prosperity did not happen by accident. American sea power, combined with the dedication of our allies and partners, guaranteed freedom of navigation, maintained peace, and fostered a rules-based order. So, and that has, over 70 years, brought a prosperity that has positively influenced, I believe, positively influenced many people on the globe. And so as we look forward to the future in the Indo-Pacific, we look to cooperate further with our allies and partners, and many of which are in the room here, and to bring progress and prosperity to as many as possible. And with that, I yield the balance of my time to the distinguished Jonathan.
Well, thank you very much, Admiral Moninger. You were great on time, and I think it was an apt sort of finishing to this first part of the panel, and I hope really has stimulated thoughts. You guys aren't off the hook yet, so I think the hard part comes after the coffee period. But a couple of the ideas that you mentioned, Admiral, and I think have been highlighted by a lot of your colleagues, trust, interests. I heard that from maybe all of the panelists. What I agree with you, and I think that's a fundamental point to the Five Eyes. What would be interesting in the second part of the panel, and maybe I'm trying to give some ideas here for the audience, is adaptability and innovation. So with all of the challenges that we've heard of in the last 2 days, with all of the headwinds that we have, not to mention a recession that we're probably already in, it's going to get worse, Russia's war in Ukraine, all of the different challenges directly in the Indo-Pacific, how can the Five Eyes adapt to this situation? How can it innovate? How can it evolve to meet some of these challenges? And I think part of that is going to be looking at working hand in hand with partners, especially some trusted partners in the region. So that being said, that's part two. So I'm going to let everyone have a little bit of a break, about 20 minutes. Get yourself some coffee. I promise not to abuse too much of it as moderator, but I will abuse some of it as moderator to pose a first few questions. Is that we're going to do this in a lightning round format. So I know it's very tough taskmaster to ask you to do your initial comments in 3 to 5 minutes. I'm going to ask you to respond to these in about 60 seconds if you can. 60. So really testing your sort of your skills here. But the first sort of question I have, and I'm going to go down sequentially like I did before, is on this idea of working with partners. So I mentioned adapting and evolving to some of the challenges. We can think, I don't necessarily have to list them, the potential additions to the eyes of the Five Eyes Plus, but there are key partners, key allies in this region that I think that we should be working with much more closely. That doesn't necessarily mean that we expand the SIGINT group that is traditionally the Five Eye, but finding ways to incorporate those partners much more in our work, I personally think is a very, very important thing to meet some of the challenges in this region. So I wondered if each of you could comment a little bit about this, and if you're more willing to discuss who those partners might be. Who would those partners be that you think are most important in the Indo-Pacific to incorporate much more deeply with some of the Five Eye work? So if I could start with our Australian friend.
So Australia is a three-ocean navy, Pacific Ocean, Indian Ocean, Southern Ocean. So when we look at those sort of aspects, we have maritime borders with Papua New Guinea, East Timor, Indonesia and France. So they are sort of the people that we're sitting around in the space there. Obviously Pacific is really important to us, the Pacific Forum and all those sort of aspects. And all of the major Pacific players and that are important in building out and supporting, obviously with New Zealand, but all of the Five Eyes nations, but also France there. Indian Ocean is another area of real focus for us. India is very important. Sri Lanka is an important partner as we see a lot of the issues around Sri Lanka and a lot of the unauthorised arrivals floating down through there and a lot of the response operations we do there in the Indian Ocean. I also look at some of those other areas like Indian Ocean Naval Symposium. You had to have WPNS over here. Interesting one with things like the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium is the US aren't part of that. It's a consensus forum. Iran is part of that. US will never be part of that as a result. But it's a really good platform for some of us others to present ideas around the stuff we've been talking around the importance of the maritime space in environments that have groups of people that may not necessarily be sitting in some of those other forums that we're operating in. So I think that at both the political, the maritime level and more broadly, we have partners all around there, but ASEAN is the predominant partner in Southeast Asia. They are very important, Pacific, but I think India is another really big one for us.
Much, Admiral, and I think that's a really important point about, again, about complementarity and being almost like a force multiplier. The idea that you have different nodes of connection. Each of the five has different nodes of connection and different sort of multilateral groups as well. One I think about for Australia, for example, is Australia, India, and Japan have a trilateral that doesn't include the United States. Yes, there is the Quad, but there are other networks that I think individually each of the countries have that could be of benefit. If I can pass along to my Canadian colleague, Admiral Waddell, please.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I'm always a bit reluctant for me to kind of select from a list all of those preferred partners we think are important to engage in, because frankly, everybody that we work with in the Indo-Pacific is an important partner, and whether it's a very small, modest country and or navy, or a significant one, they all bring an interesting perspective that we need to understand as we maneuver into that space. We have a strong working relationship politically, but more importantly, from our perspectives, through the maritime and forces lens, strong relationships with Japan, with South Korea, are a couple of key Southeast Asian partners who we work closely with as we determine how we can best engage in the region. Obviously, our historical connections to the Five Eyes community is important, but we've also found, even as recently as some of our re-engagements in countries such as Malaysia and Indonesia, and others have been really important opportunities for us. But sometimes our engagement comes closer to home, and even working with our American allies is to encourage and in our dialogue, convince others that, as I said in my opening comments, that we are a Pacific nation. And I find that sometimes there's a tendency to compartmentalize geographically from a land-based perspective. Well, Canada, you're part of North America, so your perspective should be in the Western Hemisphere, when the reality is when you're looking at other challenges and opportunities in the economic space across the maritime theater, for all the obvious reasons, we continue to look west. And reminding again that Canada has to look on the 4 points of the cardinal. Yes, we look east for our NATO and European connection points, north for our vast Arctic interests, south to our neighbor to the south, and of course hemispheric interests in the counter-narcotic mission to the south. But as I said at the start, getting into the Pacific is first and foremost based on the economic connections where we need to be, and we can only do that effectively if we're talking to other partners and learning from their experiences, finding out where we need to be, where we need to engage. Thanks.
That's a great point, Admiral. And in addition to the economic nodes and equities that Canada and other countries have, I think even of expatriates, for example, the amount of Canadian citizens that live in the Indo-Pacific region. Of course, other countries here represented as well. And we hope there's not one of those contingencies. We hope there's not a contingency over Taiwan. We hope there's not a contingency in the Korean Peninsula. But we have to prepare if there is one. And I think that's a good point as well, is that we need to have those partnerships with countries in the region. If that case does happen, if that scenario does happen, we have to have those building block agreements and operational exchanges to ensure that we can protect our civilians in the country as well as our sort of economic stakes. Commodore Ross, please.
Besides the Five Eyes, there are a number of forums we're already a part of. I think the Defence Pacific Quads, which is the US, Australia, New Zealand and France, a really important forum. We have the Southwest Pacific Heads of Maritime Forces, which are all of the Pacific Islands, Southwest Pacific Islands, and that was started by New Zealand and Australia. So another important forum which goes down to the smallest of our Pacific Islands, including Kiribati, Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, the Joint Heads of Pacific Security, which has been in Fiji last week or the week before, and that one includes the US Coast Guard as well. So then FPDA, which is talked about, we have a number of other forums that bring in a lot of other countries besides the Five Eyes.
Thank you very much. Admiral Remington, please.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's interesting that we're talking about the Five Eyes. I mentioned a number of the other organizations that are significant to the UK and have been through history. I think there are a couple of things that are probably driving it, which are useful just to bring out now. So the first one is, as I said, whatever happens tomorrow in terms of the UK budget and where we think that's going to head, it's been made really clear to Defence that we are an extension of the government, and it's diplomacy by other means, isn't it? And actually, the bottom line is about trade. So the UK is going to be driven by the trading arrangements that are important to us, and in the Pacific, that includes pretty much all the countries that are represented here, and that's going to drive the sorts of things that Defence will be interested in as we look for the areas that in a post-Brexit Britain we can look to build our trade arrangements. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is to do with history, and one of the groupings I didn't mention, and I probably should have done in my opening remarks, was the Commonwealth. And it remains a really important institution as far as the UK is concerned. A number of the smaller countries in the Pacific are members of the Commonwealth, and they mean a great deal to us for both historical reasons, but also because they're great partners and they're people we enjoy working with. So I think the Commonwealth is the second area that I would bring out that I didn't mention in my opening remarks, Jonathan.
That's a really great insight, and one that is important to bring up, especially from a Canadian perspective as well. So thank you, Admiral. Admiral Moninger, please.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Couple thoughts. For expanding Five Eyes or other partnerships, one size doesn't fit all. The United States has global interests and a global network of allies and partners, and not all of them get along ideally, and nor nor should we seek to have everybody aligned together, because there's differing interests. And it's already been alluded to. Each of the other the countries represented here have unique relationships that engender access that that the U.S. may not benefit, may not have, because of the way the U.S. is viewed, or just the uniqueness of geography or anything else. And so that diversity, so to speak, should be leveraged, I think. Naturally, the United States, looks to partner with allies who we have, treaties and alliances with, represented here, NATO, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, and so those matter, and all those interests don't always intersect, and I think everybody respects that. As well, not everything is an alliance; it's a treaty. You mentioned already the Quad, very important way of kind of looking at problems in the Indo-Pacific, and so the countries represented there are important from a partnership standpoint, and then. The one size doesn't fit all. We talked about bilateral, trilateral, multilateral. The one organization that worth highlighting is the Indo-Pacific Maritime Coordination Cell. An opportunity for to really coordinate across a diversity of countries and interests, and forums like that, in addition to any particular alliance or partnership. I think that diversity of opportunities to share trust. I think is what we could see as part of expanding.
Thanks very much. And as you can see, this panel not only has a long distinguished career as sailors, but immense diplomatic acumen as well. And thank you so much for a lot of those great insights. I have more questions in my quiver, but I get a few hours with you all tomorrow, so I'm going to save those in the quiver and open this up to the audience. So just a couple points similar to other questions. Please make your questions as very brief as possible. Avoid lengthy comments if you can, and do please identify yourself before asking questions. So with that being said, I see a gentleman in the back, I believe. And one more point, if you are directing your question to one person on the panel or all the panel, please do specify that as well.
David Collins, a former sailor. We've been around the buoy on this before regarding Indo-Pacific, and I don't want to rain on the parade, but some of us here will remember 25 years ago, Canada had a year of Asia-Pacific. We had a great hoopla, that fizzled out. We've had tilts to the Asia-Pacific. We've expanded involvement on this coast and so on, heading into the Indo-Pacific. Can any of you on the panel give the audience an assurance that we're in this for real this time, and it's not just a response to China and the threat or challenge it makes to us? Are we in for the long haul now? Thank you.
Okay, great. That might be one for Admiral Waddell, but before you have a little bit of time to think about that, I'm going to grab one or two more questions, if you don't mind. So does anyone else have questions? Yes, gentlemen.
Hi, Commander Lane, Defense Policy in Ottawa. What do you think of a standing Indo-Pacific maritime group?
Great, and very good question. And one more, please. Yes, sir.
I have Frank Buckton, just Naval Association. I have two questions. Number one, are those false islands that China has built in the South China Sea, are they capable of servicing a ship? And two, does anyone have any sort of an alliance with Taiwan?
Excellent. Okay, so a lot of easy questions that we have for the first round on the panel here. So maybe, Admiral Waddell, if I can start with you first, and again, pick and choose on these questions. You can't avoid the Canada question because no one else is going to pick that one. But do feel free for the rest of the panel to pick and choose out of those ones. Taiwan, South China Sea, Standing Maritime Group, there's a lot in there. But Admiral Waddell, we'll start with you, please.
So you want me to start with the easy one, like an alliance with Taiwan, right? Okay. I think I'll get to after the first question. I don't, frankly, I don't know if we are back or not. That's not really for me to answer in terms of the Indo-Pacific. as I said earlier, I'm looking forward to this Indo-Pacific strategy announcement because that will guide and shape a number of our investments and how we want to align our military contributions to support government policy. The Navy's known for a long time that we have been an Indo-Pacific player, and we've been operating that space for years and years. We've got 2 frigates forward deployed now, enacting government policy. We've been in the Pacific for years, year over year, almost persistently with naval deployments. So I don't know how else we can message it or say it from a Navy perspective. We're a Pacific contributor, we're in the Pacific, and the Navy will stay in the Pacific. It's just a matter of where the narrative goes in terms of government policy, I suppose, but we're enacting government policy all the time, sometimes whether they know it or not.
Great answer. Full-throated agreement with you. So Admiral Smith, what's your views on which easy questions do you want to answer?
I'm going to start with the Canadian one. You guys have been there. We have Canadians on exchange in Australia, have had ever since I've been in the Navy. We've had Australians over here. You know, being there constantly is an economic, it's a situational, it's a political aspect around that. But throughout, you know, my 30 plus years in the Navy, I can't remember a time where the Canadian Navy has not been part of my career, and I didn't come to this side of the world from a maritime perspective till I was commanding Canberra in 2016. So Canada's there. It may not be there in the big force that you may want to see there, but they are definitely having an influence in the space. With regard to the islands in the South China Sea, I don't think that you find that they've got the capacity to do the full servicing of ships in those sort of aspects, but they have significant infrastructure and capacity, as you saw. It gives reach, it gives range, it gives awareness in those spaces, and we had those sort of discussions. Again, leaning into that, also talking about that standing Indo-Pacific group. Australia at the moment's got 7 ships and just under 2,000 people in Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia. We constantly deploy ships up into that region. It would be rare for us not to have at least 1, more often 2 or 3. We coordinate those deployments with partners near and far. When the UK Carrier Strike Group came out, the French Carrier Strike Group comes through, German and Dutch ships involved. We will incorporate ourselves into those deployments. We have done transits through the South China Sea with Canadian ships, with US ships on a fairly regular basis. The Indo-Pacific Maritime Coordination Cell that was mentioned earlier is designed specifically to coordinate the activities of all those countries. So although we don't have a standing force as such, and I'm quite happy later to discuss my views on why we don't want a NATO-type environment in that part of the world, I don't think it'd be very productive. I think you find that we have a very well-coordinated system that enables us to optimise every opportunity that the other navies and other groups come through. And it's not just Navy either, it's aviation assets and the coordination of maritime patrol aircraft and those sort of other aspects there. So we are constantly operating together across the Pacific in the Indo-Pacific, Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia in a very coordinated and deliberate way, which doesn't place necessarily great demands on any of the countries, but recognises that when opportunities come up, everyone leans forward to go into that space. So I do think that we have a very well coordinated and a very positive relationship in regard to that. And I think that that is very well received by most of the countries in the region.
Great. We're going to move just over to our end here across the metaphorical Pacific to Admiral Moninger. I don't know if your colleagues have kindly left the Taiwan question for you, but there's a few others there that you might want to chime in as well. Admiral, please.
Okay, challenge accepted. I'm just going to go down in order of the things that I want to answer, if that works. So Indo-Pacific for the long haul, great question. You know, the United States Navy has the majority of its operating forces in the Pacific and has for a very long time. I'll just use aircraft carriers, although this doesn't quite make my example. You know, there are 5 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers in the Pacific, whether deployed or home-ported. That represents a little under half of our fleet, of our aircraft carrier fleet, but for perspective, we do all our heavy overhauls on the East Coast. So when the ships are overhauled, they go back out to the Pacific. And additionally, on any given day, the United States military has the bulk of its deployed forces in the Indo-Pacific region. That's across all services. So we're in the Indo-Pacific to stay. And but we can't take our eye off the other coast. We are we look in the Western Hemisphere, look to the west, look to the east, and globally. I think the standing maritime force is addressed. I'm going to pass on the false island question. I just don't know enough about it. And then with Taiwan, the United States has a recognition of a one China policy, which recognizes that Taiwan is associated with China, but the territory of it, but that that one China policy speaks to a peaceful, ultimately a peaceful unification of Taiwan with mainland China, but that's again peaceful and voluntary, and we do not. So we at the same time do not support a unilateral declaration of independence to sort of maintain the fact that we do have additionally one other comment. We're governed by law. We have a defense agreement with Taiwan to consult about defensive matters and to be informed of issues. I'll point out that in the United States Navy, for example, or within the Navy, we train approximately 40 Taiwanese personnel at our schools, at our war colleges, and with the goal of helping them develop a professional military. So that's what I got.
Remington, please.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I'll deal with the first two, if I may. So have we been here before for an Asia, sort of from our perspective, an Asia-Pacific tilt? I think, anyone who's been following UK politics over the last year will be unsurprised to hear me say that there is a connection between the Prime Minister of the day and the line that we take when it comes to our involvement in the Indo-Pacific. But I think it's clear that the last three Prime Ministers have all been really clear that we're here for the long haul. It is prosperity driven, as I said beforehand. And to that end, we can see a future set of trading relationships that are based in this part of the world, and that drives where the military gets involved. And I mentioned in my remarks that we've got 2 offshore patrol vessels effectively based out here now. They're not really based anywhere. They're using commercial shipping arrangements to do their maintenance, and they are picking up a lot of the tasking that we've not been able to service for a long time. And that's not just now. We're building 2 classes of frigate in the UK at the moment. One of them, the Type 26, which you'll be more than familiar with. The second, the Type 31, and the whole operating procedures that were written down as policy in terms of the Type 31 procurement was around having them forward deployed. And the expectation is that at least 1 and possibly 2 of them will operate in the Pacific in due course. So that's a class of ships that isn't built yet. The first ones they've cut steel on and are building right now. But that, I think, points to an expectation that we'll be operating here in the future as well. So this is not just something for here and now. It's certainly something that's part of the UK's future. And just on the question regarding standing maritime groups, the UK has a fair amount of experience of dealing with standing maritime groups from our work with NATO in the European theatre, and we have found them to be a useful construct that certainly is good for getting groups of like-minded nations together to operate together, to refine tactics and procedures, and the utility of them is not to be underestimated. However, I think I would observe as well that in this theatre, the one that we're describing, we are the amateurs, and we would fit in with what the professionals recommend. So to begin with, certainly what we're finding with our OPVs is that bilateral arrangements are working really well, and it's giving us the opportunity to touch base with people we've not worked with for some time. The UK Carrier Strike Group deployment last year gave us the opportunity to bring larger groups of shipping together to work around an aircraft carrier and a strike group, and that gives us the opportunity to exercise, tri- and multilateral arrangements as well. So I think we don't see ourselves as the convener of those sorts of groups at the moment. That's not really our place, I don't think. On the other hand, we are more than willing to get involved in those groups that might already exist in this area. That would be an opportunity for us to further UK aims.
Thanks, John.
Excellent. Commodore Ross, please.
We did learn in World War II when we had most of our troops over in the Far East or Europe in the Marines came to New Zealand that it would be better just to leave some of our men in the country and not let the Marines look after them. So we are in the Pacific for good, and that will be where we'll stay. But that's not the only place that we operate. We are also very much looking to operate in the Antarctic area, the Southern Ocean. That as well, besides the Pacific, is becoming more contested, and we'll certainly look to operate there with our partners. We also joined the Carrier Strike Group, and our tanker is currently, or just left Japan after being through the South China Sea as well with those that are up here. So we, yes, we'll stay in the Pacific, but we operate elsewhere as well. On the question of the alliance with Taiwan, people get nervous, but my answer is from a Navy, no, we don't.
Excellent, thanks. And thanks for mentioning the Antarctic too. I mean, maybe this is MSC 2023, a very good idea for a panel. And as you rightly say, this is a key interest for New Zealand. Okay, so now we are in the actual lightning round. We're in the extra lightning round. We're running very short on time. But I do, if there are other questions, I will take two, but they have to be very, very quick. So please make them very brief questions. Yes.
Hi, Darshana Bora with the Carnegie Endowment. The geopolitical landscape when the group was set up was very different than what it is now, from colonialism to sub-regional politics. The 5 governments did not necessarily share the same threat assessment, even vis-a-vis China. So I was wondering how, if there were challenges that comes up in sharing that information and intelligence, and how the group navigates that in 21st century, given the historical structures that it was set up in and where it stands today. Thank you.
Now we're getting into the meat. Threat assessments on China. One more question, please, if there is. That could be enough, I think, to keep us into happy hour. Okay, let's close with this. So this is a really good question to looking at. Oh, okay. Did you want to repeat one more time? I think I believe she was talking about the different threat assessments that within the Five Eyes on China, and whether that might lead to some disparities in the way that you might want to share intelligence. I don't want to misframe your question.
Yes, that's correct.
So that's sort of the gist of the question, whether there's different threat assessments and how that might affect information sharing. So we'll start with, you have the unfortunate job of being right next to me, Admiral Smith, so you got to go first.
We're going to use your traditional name next year and you can go the right. Yeah, that's one of the beauties of Five Eyes, as I mentioned. You know, there is room for different views, and the threat assessments that are built out, many of them are looked at through different lenses in terms of specific capabilities or specific outcomes. I think the integration of our people in different headquarters, we heard last night from Chris that, you know, the Deputy Commander of Pac Fleet is an Australian Admiral, and you know, he's gone over there and gets very good access in the space. We have high-level US representation. Actually, we have high-level representation from all of these people, not only in our various domain headquarters, but also out in our joint ops area. In terms of the fleet commanders across the Pacific in most of the nations sync, including the plus countries, so you're talking Korea and Japan as well. They sync almost fortnightly in terms of talking around those sort of aspects. I head into the Fleet Command role next year, and I've already spent time with the 7th Fleet Commander. I've spent time with the 3rd Fleet Commander, the Royal Navy Fleet Commander, in having discussions leading up into that space. So I think in terms of the different views and ideas, of course there's going to be different views around assessments and that, but that just adds colour to understanding exactly what we're looking at in terms of those aspects. And I think it provides us an opportunity to be able to have those discussions from a warfighting perspective. I think if you look at other conversations that have already been had here, I mean, in Australia, we talk about interchangeability now with our key allies. We talk about the speed of relevance, and when we talk about the speed of relevance, you're talking about being able to engage in high-end warfighting with the level of threat that's out there effectively, knowing that those people that are sitting with you in that space are going to respond in the same way that you would expect someone from your own country to respond in going out to that effort. So that's a pretty high bar to set in the space there. But I think collectively, we are seeing a lot of effort moving towards that going forward. So it's pretty exciting.
Excellent. Admiral Waddell, please.
Yeah, just a 10-second soundbite. I just spent 3 years working with the U.S. Navy in Norfolk, embedded in 2nd Fleet. The preponderance of all intelligence and operations briefs were done at the Five Eyes level. And so I would just share that the information exchange is robust and effective and relevant.
Excellent. Commodore Ross, please.
I talked about developing those really deep bonds we call tangata to tangata, people-to-people bonds. And I think that's what we do in the Five Eyes, and sharing is, for us, really, it's around trust and, yeah, those real deep bonds, I think, and historical bonds are important.
Excellent. Admiral Remington, please.
Yeah, I think we've all spent time emphasizing how Five Eyes has moved on from its original purpose. But essentially, it is about intelligence sharing and information sharing. So I think one of the things that will bind us together is that we get to look at the same picture, essentially. So when it comes to making threat assessments, there's the opportunity to see the same information between the nations represented here on the stage. And yes, that's still, as the point was made earlier, that still gives us the space and time to make our own assessments and our own decision making about how we go ahead and act on that information. But the starting point is that we're looking at the same picture. So that's got to be a good place when it comes to coherence of action. And I'd just emphasize what we heard about exchange officers and the importance of really close personal linkages that we know exist between certainly chiefs of Navy downwards amongst this group that you've got sat here. And that's really essential when it comes to providing the right level of rigor to the relationship and the actions that we take.
Okay, Admiral Moninger.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, by the way, and I just say what all they said. That's the answer. No, actually what they said, and one size doesn't fit all, and that includes analysis. We share data, and we expect everyone to analyze it based on their perspectives, and that's going to be geographic, it's going to be cultural, and that's important. And then we share those perspectives as well. And so a healthy relationship has room for difference. And then I'll just the final footnote, or final note on this, we share the common value of the military subordination to civilian leadership. And some of that leadership guides how we look at problems. And that's the way that's the way that should be. And it does influence, how we would analyze a problem. So, but a great question. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, a perfect panel, perfectly on time as well, ending here. All the good things must come to an end. I do believe that you've earned your happy hour drink or two. We've definitely fielded you with a range of tough questions. But let's have a round of applause here for our panel here.